I got the story from a man named David Kraus. He's 63 now. He's been living in rural northwestern Colorado for the last 8 years, on a property that sits at the edge of the White River National Forest near Glenwood Springs. He contacted me because he saw my piece on Roger Falk's log from Mason County, and he said what he'd been carrying alone for a decade was close enough to the same thing that he needed to get it down before he died. He didn't want his name used. I pushed back. He pushed harder. So, here's what I'll tell you. David Kraus is a constructed name. Everything else he told me is exactly as it happened. Before we dive in, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel for more untold stories like this one. Turn on notifications so you don't miss a single episode. And if you find this story compelling, leave a like and a comment below. Now, let me tell you what really happened. He met his wife, Susan, in 1988. She was a biologist with the U.S. Forest Service, specializing in large mammal ecology. He was a contractor, carpentry, and general construction work, the kind of guy who could build a cabin from frame to roofing and make it structurally sound. They got married in 1992. They wanted kids. It didn't happen. They tried for 12 years. Fertility clinics, surgery, the whole expensive machinery of attempting to manufacture a family. Nothing took. By 2004, they'd made a decision to stop trying. They were both in their late 40s. They had a good life together. They had a house they'd built themselves on, 5 acres of aspen and mixed conifer forest, about 8 miles northeast of Glenwood Springs. They had work that mattered to them. They accepted that the kids thing wasn't going to happen. Then one night in early September 2004, Susan came home from a 3-day field expedition into the deeper parts of the White River National Forest, where she'd been tracking elk migration patterns. She was quiet during dinner. She didn't talk about the work, which was unusual. Usually she wanted to go through what she'd observed, the herd composition, the movements, the seasonal shifts. That night she ate quietly and went to bed early, and he assumed she was just tired from the field work. She wasn't in bed. He found her on the back porch in the dark, sitting on the steps, not looking at anything in particular. He sat down next to her and waited. She said, "I found something that shouldn't exist." David didn't press. He knew Susan well enough to know she'd explain when she was ready. She said she'd been camped in a high meadow near the headwaters of Plateau Creek, about 18 miles northeast of where they lived, documenting the late summer movement of a cow elk that she'd been tracking for 3 seasons. The elk had a GPS collar. Susan had triangulated its position and set up camp about half a mile downwind, waiting for it to come into visual range. The meadow was at about 9,000 feet. The air up there was thin and sharp. It smelled like alpine grass and the mineral coldness of exposed rock. She'd been sitting in that meadow for 6 hours before the sun went down, watching the tree line through binoculars, waiting for the elk to move from the deep forest into the open ground where she could see it clearly. On the second night, around 2 in the morning, she heard a sound she couldn't place. An animal sound, but wrong. Bigger than anything that should be there. Not a roar, not a howl, something in between. Almost intentional, like an animal trying to communicate instead of establishing dominance or calling a mate. The sound came from somewhere in the darkness beyond the meadow edge, maybe 300 yards out. It held for about 5 seconds. Then it stopped. Susan's hand went to the rifle that was lying next to her sleeping bag. She stayed inside the tent, listening. The nylon walls were thin. If something wanted to come through them, they wouldn't slow it down at all. She had a rifle. Most of Susan's career, she carried a rifle. She knew how to use it. She could group shots at 200 yards with consistency. But the sound she'd heard didn't belong to anything she had a file for in her head. She knew the sound of an animal in pain, and she was reasonably sure what she'd heard wasn't pain. It was something else. Something that sounded almost like language. Almost like a voice that hadn't learned how to shape human words. In the morning, she saw the tracks. Enormous prints in the soft ground near the creek, 5-toed, bipedal, with a toe configuration that was almost human, except the dimensions were wrong, too large. The second toe extended longer than the big toe. She measured them with a field ruler, 15 inches long, 11 inches wide at the palm. She found more tracks, a trail that seemed to parallel the creek, weaving between the trees, moving with purpose. She followed it cautiously for about 2 hours and then found something that made her stop walking. A den. an actual shelter made of stacked branches and roofed with bark and deadfall, oriented toward the south with a clear view of the meadow where she'd been watching the elk. The den itself was empty. Whatever had been living there was gone, but inside, arranged in what Susan described as a way that suggested intentionality, were objects. A bird's skull, pieces of flint, a bone that had been carved into something that might have been a tool or might have been nothing at all, a piece of human clothing, a child's shirt, red, weathered, decades old by the look of it. She took a photograph with her field camera. She left everything else where it was. She broke camp that afternoon and came home. She showed David the photograph. He looked at it and felt something shift in the way he understood the world. What she had found suggested intelligence. It suggested intention. It suggested something living in that forest that was not documented, not cataloged, not supposed to exist. Susan said, "I'm going back." He said, "You're not going back alone." 2 weeks later, David and Susan made a trip to that meadow together. They had a plan. They would set up a camp with enough visibility to cover multiple approaches. They would bring recording equipment. They would try to gather evidence that was documentation quality, the kind of thing a scientist could defend in front of a peer group. They had a tape recorder, a decent camera, a video camera that was expensive at the time. They had notebooks. They had hope. They saw nothing. They spent 5 days in that meadow. They recorded the forest sounds. They walked the creek bed. They found no new tracks, no movement, nothing. It was as if whatever Susan had encountered had moved on, or learned that humans were in the area and had gone deeper into the wilderness. On the last day, David was walking a game trail about a mile from camp when he heard a sound that made every hair on his body stand on end. A vocalization that came from somewhere in the trees about 100 yards out. It wasn't a word. It was more like an animal attempting to speak, attempting to make a sound with vocal cords that were built for something other than human language. It held for about 3 seconds. Then it stopped. David called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" No response. They packed up the afternoon and left. It was the middle of October by the time they got back to the house. Susan was frustrated. The evidence was circumstantial, a photograph of a structure that could have been natural, tracks that were dramatic but could potentially be interpreted as a bear or an elk or something documented. She wasn't satisfied. She wanted proof. David said, "Maybe that's the point. Maybe the proof you're looking for is not something you're supposed to find." She didn't like that answer. She went back up to that meadow alone in November. She set up camp and waited. She waited through late November into early December. And somewhere around the middle of December, in weather that was getting too cold for her to safely be out in a tent alone, she came back down. She didn't say much about what happened. She said she'd made contact. She said the thing, the creature, whatever it was not aggressive. She said it was curious. She said it had come close enough to the camp on the last night that she could have touched it if she'd wanted to, but she didn't. She said she understood something about it that she couldn't articulate. She said it was intelligent. She said it was afraid. 2 weeks after she came back from that trip, she told David she was pregnant. It was impossible. They'd spent 12 years trying. She'd had tests, multiple tests. Fertility specialists had confirmed that her eggs were not viable, that her reproductive system was not going to produce a child. And yet, she was pregnant. The doctor who examined her was confused. There was no explanation, but there was a fetus. They had ultrasound confirmation. David sat with that information and understood, without Susan saying it, what she was telling him. The creature in the forest was male. Susan had spent multiple nights in that meadow alone, and something had happened up there. He didn't know the specifics. He wasn't sure he wanted to know the specifics, but he knew what his wife was saying. He said, "We have to tell someone." Susan said, "Who? Who are we going to tell? A wildlife biologist who got pregnant by a cryptid. They'll take the baby the moment it's born. They'll take it from us and they'll study it. It'll spend its life in a laboratory. That's not happening," David argued. He said they couldn't just hide this. He said it was science. He said the world needed to know. Susan said, "The world doesn't get to know this." She said, "If you leave, I understand. I won't fight you. But I'm having this baby, and I'm raising it, and I'm not telling anyone." He didn't leave. The pregnancy was unusual, medically impossible. Susan's body seemed to be accelerating. The fetus grew at a rate that was about 50% faster than normal. By month 5, she was showing the size of a 7-month pregnancy. By month 7, she was as large as any woman who was due any day. The doctors were concerned, but the fetal heartbeat was strong. The development was progressing normally, just compressed into a shorter timeline. They had a son in March of 2005, 9 weeks early, 7 pounds, perfectly formed, every test showing a healthy infant, dark hair, grayish-blue eyes that became amber over the course of his first weeks, teeth that came in early, an appetite that was voracious. He ate more than any human infant should have been able to eat. He grew visibly from day to day. By the time he was 2 weeks old, he weighed what a 6-week-old baby should weigh. They named him Michael Kraus. They told people he'd been born to a surrogate. They said it was complicated, but the biology didn't matter. He was theirs. They brought him home to their house on 5 acres in the forest, and they started to raise him. He grew fast. By 6 months, he had the size of a healthy 2-year-old. By a year old, he was the size of a normal 4-year-old. His development was physically rapid, but his cognitive development seemed roughly aligned with his chronological age, not his apparent size. He learned to speak late, around 2 years old, and he spoke the way a 2-year-old speaks, in fragments and approximations. But his voice was different from a human child's voice. Lower, resonant. There was a faint vibration to it that you could feel in your chest when he was upset. They made decisions about his care as they went. They kept him inside. They couldn't bring him to public places. His appearance would have drawn questions they couldn't answer. Visitors came by rarely. They told people they didn't want to expose an infant to the risk of illness from relatives. Most people understood. The ones who pushed back, they gently distanced themselves from over time. Susan continued her work with the Forest Service. She'd taken maternity leave, but by the fall of 2005, she went back part-time. David hired someone to watch Michael during the days she was gone. A woman named Betty Voigt, 60-something, who'd lost her husband and was living alone on a small property 2 miles away. Betty needed the work and the company. Michael needed someone to watch him. It worked. Betty was the first person outside the family to spend significant time with Michael. She came to the house on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. She was a quiet woman, not prone to asking questions, not prone to comment much on anything. David was grateful for that. He'd been worried about what Betty would think, what she would do. He had scenarios where she called someone, social services, the police, a news organization. None of those conversations happened. Betty watched Michael. She made him lunch. She watched him play in the backyard. And over months, she came to accept that whatever Michael was, he was loved and he was cared for. And he was as safe as any child in a stable home. By Michael's 3rd year, his growth had slowed. It hadn't stopped, but the rate of increase had normalized to something closer to a normal human trajectory. He was bigger than other kids his age, but not incomprehensibly so. If you didn't look too closely, if you didn't examine the structure of his face or the position of his shoulders, he could pass for a tall, stocky 5-year-old. The amber eyes were the giveaway, but David and Susan kept him inside, and the only people who saw him regularly were Betty and a doctor who was sympathetic enough to ask fewer questions than most. They lived. Michael learned things. He was intelligent, quick to understand language, good at problem solving. He had emotions. He got angry when frustrated. He wanted affection. He wanted to be held. He wanted his parents. He was a child in every way that mattered, except for the fact that he was visibly not human and his growth pattern was not following anything in the medical literature. By the time he was 6 years old in appearance, David and Susan had settled into a routine that felt almost normal, if you could call anything about this situation normal. They had family dinners. Michael would sit at the table with them and eat, his amber eyes watching everything, learning how humans conducted themselves around food, around each other. He started asking questions. Why do people cook food if it tastes better raw? A question Susan had asked herself many times. Why don't you hunt at night like the other animals do? Another unanswerable question that David and Susan had to navigate without explanations. David taught Michael how to build things. Simple things at first. A birdhouse out of scrap wood. Michael's claws made it difficult to hold the hammer correctly, but he learned. He learned to aim the hammer at the nail and not at his own hand. He learned that mistakes hurt and that it was worth the pain to make something correctly. He would sit next to his father in the workshop behind the house and watch David's hands move with precision and he would try to replicate that precision with claws that were built for tearing flesh, not for fine carpentry. Susan taught him to read. She sat with him for hours with picture books and then chapter books, sounding out words, explaining concepts. Michael had an intuitive grasp of language that was remarkable. By the time he was 7 in appearance, he was reading at a 10th grade level. He asked her about the books they read. Why did the character do this thing? What would you do in that situation? The questions of a child trying to understand a world he could never fully inhabit. They had to decide what to do long term. They couldn't keep him inside forever. At some point, he would be old enough that confinement would become cruel. They couldn't send him to school. They couldn't integrate him into society. They could homeschool him, but he was growing into something that looked too different to walk unnoticed down a street. David and Susan made a choice. They would tell the government, not everything, not the origin story, but they would reach out to the Forest Service, the department David's wife worked for, and they would create a story about a child with a genetic condition and see if there was any way to set up a legal framework that would protect him. It was risky, but the alternative was keeping a growing child locked in a house forever, and that was not something either of them could accept. Susan made the outreach. She talked to her supervisor at the Forest Service in Glenwood Springs. She said she and her husband had a child with a severe genetic condition that made him appear extremely different from normal humans. She said they were looking for advice on medical care, legal documentation, education options. She said they wanted to do the right thing, but they didn't want their child taken from them. The conversation went to a higher level. There were calls from Denver, there were meetings. A woman named Helen Reyes, who worked for a division of the Forest Service that David had never even known existed, came to the house. She spent an afternoon with Michael. She was professional, clinical, and when she left, she said, "I'm going to make some calls." 2 weeks later, David and Susan had papers, a legal framework for Michael's existence, a designation that made him a protected individual under the care of 2 identified guardians, medical documentation that was vague enough to not trigger alarm, but specific enough to explain why he would never be enrolled in public school or receive a standard medical workup. The papers were sealed. They created a kind of legal fiction that allowed Michael to exist in a way that wouldn't expose the family to criminal liability. The woman Helen Reyes made it clear that there were government people who knew about Michael, not a lot of them. A small department in Denver, a few specialists who dealt with anomalies. Helen herself, who continued to visit once or twice a year, always unannounced, always asking the same questions. How is he developing? What has he exhibited? Has there been any unusual behavior? Has anything changed? Michael grew up in that house on 5 acres. He had an unusual childhood. He had parents who loved him. He had limits on his freedom that were both practical and legal. He learned to read. He learned mathematics. He learned to cook because Susan taught him. He learned to fix things because David taught him. He had chores. He had a consistent bedtime. He had a life, constrained by the fact that he could never leave his property without planning, never be seen by the outside world, never have friends his own age. The trade-off was safety. As long as he stayed invisible, no one came for him. No one tried to take him. No government body other than Helen Reyes and her small department knew he existed. By the time Michael was 10 years old, he had the physical appearance of a young man. He was over 6 feet tall. His features were more defined than they had been. His face had matured into something recognizably not human. His shoulders were broad. His hands were large and strong. He had spent a decade confined to 5 acres of forest and the interior of a house that his parents had expanded over the years to give him more space. He understood his situation. He knew he was different. He knew he was the only one of his kind. He accepted it the way children accept the circumstances of their lives. This was his normal. There was not a lot to compare it to. And then, on an afternoon in September 2014, 10 years after Susan first came home from the forest and said she'd found something that shouldn't exist, something happened that changed everything. Michael was outside on the property, in a fenced area in the back that David had built over the years, a space where he could move around without being visible from the road. He was 17 years old in appearance, probably about 17 in actual development. He was sitting on a log, doing something he did regularly. He was listening to the forest, just listening, head tilted, eyes half closed, in a state that seemed almost meditative. The fence ran along the boundary where the property met the true wilderness, where the managed forest of their 5 acres gave way to the dense national forest beyond. Michael sat with his back to the fence, his massive shoulders relaxed, his claws resting on his thighs. His breathing was slow and controlled. If you watched him long enough, you might notice that he was processing information through scent, that the air currents were telling him stories about which animals had passed through the area in the last few hours, what they'd eaten, which direction they'd gone. Michael's world was not the same as the human world. He inhabited it in parallel, receiving constant data streams about the living things around him that David and Susan couldn't access. David was inside the house. Susan was at work. Betty had stopped coming by several years earlier when her health declined. Michael was alone on the property except for David in the house, and David was in the kitchen making lunch when the sounds started. Something came out of the trees at the edge of the property, a shape so large that David, watching from the window, couldn't immediately process what he was looking at. A creature that was clearly the adult form of what Michael was. Massive, easily 7.5 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The fur was coarse and dense, matted in places, clean in others. The face was more developed, more predatory than Michael's. The eyes were the same amber color, but they held something different. They held experience. They held the weight of decades spent in the wild. It was female. David understood that immediately, though he couldn't have articulated why. There was something about the way she moved, the distribution of weight, the broadness of the hips, the way her shoulders narrowed. The body was built for something different than sheer strength. It was built for endurance and the carrying of young. She came to the fence. It was a high fence, 8 feet, reinforced, built over years as Michael had grown to ensure he couldn't escape without it being deliberate. The creature examined the fence the way a human would, running her hands along the rails, testing their strength. Then she looked at Michael. Michael stood up. His entire body language changed. David recognized it as recognition, as something moving from his chest toward his throat, something that Michael had been holding back for 10 years, surfacing. The creature made a sound, not a word, a vocalization that came from deep in her chest, a sound that was almost a question. Michael made the same sound back. David didn't think. He grabbed a rifle from the cabinet by the door and went outside. He pointed the rifle at the creature and said, "Step away from the fence." The creature looked at him. Her amber eyes assessed him the way a predator assesses a threat. Then she looked back at Michael. She said something. There was structure to it, variation in pitch and tone that suggested language or the attempt at language. Michael responded. Not in English, in something else, something that his parents had never heard him speak before. David said, "Michael, get in the house." Michael didn't move. David raised the rifle. "You need to move away from the fence, now." The creature looked back at him. She said something else, one word maybe, or a short phrase. She said it gently, looking at Michael the entire time. Then she turned and walked back into the forest, and she was gone. The whole thing took less than a minute. The trees swallowed her like she had never been there at all. David kept the rifle raised for several minutes, expecting her to come back. She didn't. Eventually, he lowered the gun. Michael was still standing in the middle of the yard, staring at the spot where the creature had entered the forest. David said, "Get inside." Michael looked at his father with an expression that David had never seen before. Something had broken open inside him, something that had been locked down for 10 years. Michael looked at the forest and then at his father, and he walked toward the house without speaking. That night, they had a conversation that neither of them wanted to have. Michael didn't come down from his room for hours. When David finally went upstairs to check on him, he found his son standing at the window, staring out at the darkened forest, his massive frame silhouetted against the glass. The amber eyes were wet. Tears. Michael was crying. David had seen Michael experience emotions before, but he'd never seen him cry like this. Not the frustrated tears of a child who couldn't express himself, but the deep, wrenching tears of someone who understood exactly what was happening to him and couldn't stop it. David stood in the doorway and said nothing. Michael said, "That was my mother." His voice was rough, broken in a way David had never heard it before. Michael was feeling the pull of blood. The biological imperative that had been dormant in him for 10 years was suddenly, urgently alive. He could smell her on the wind. He knew her scent the way a newborn infant knows the scent of the woman who carried it. through some ancient biological memory that language couldn't explain. Susan came home from work around 6. David had spent the afternoon thinking about what he was going to tell her. He'd walked the property. He'd examined the fence for damage. He'd found marks where she'd gripped the rails, deep gouges from claws, metal bent under pressure that would take tremendous force to generate. But the fence itself was intact. She had tested it and found it sufficient barrier for now. He told her what had happened. He said, she came to the fence. She looked at Michael. She spoke to him. He understood her. Susan sat down slowly. She understood what this meant. The clock on the life they had built with Michael had started moving faster. David said, "We need to call Helen." Susan didn't respond for a long time. Then she said, "If we call Helen, they come. They take him. We understood that when we signed those papers. There's a clause. If anything changes, if he becomes a risk or a security concern, they come." David said, "She knew where we lived. She found him. What do you think happens if we do nothing? What do you think happens when she comes back?" Michael was in his room. David and Susan could hear him moving around, restless, agitated in a way he'd never been before. The sound of his weight on the floorboards, the sound of him pacing, back and forth, a caged animal suddenly remembering what it meant to be wild. Susan said, "We have to ask him. We have to ask what he wants." That was the conversation that changed everything. That was the moment when Michael, at 10 years old chronologically and 17 by appearance, was asked to make a choice about his own life. He was asked to choose between the family that had raised him and his mother, the creature from the forest, who had walked out of the wilderness and called him by some name in a language his parents couldn't speak. He was being asked to choose between love and biology, between the comfort of the known and the pull of the blood that ran through his veins. He chose his family. He told David and Susan that he didn't want them to call Helen. He said he didn't want them to tell anyone. He said he wanted things to stay the way they were. He said he loved them. He said he was afraid of what was happening. He said he wanted his mother to leave him alone. But his voice when he said it was full of tears and his whole body was trembling, and David knew, looking at his son, that what Michael wanted was not the same as what Michael needed. They didn't call Helen that first night. They waited. David thought about it for days. He weighed the options. He thought about the clause in the legal papers. He thought about what the government people would do if they came. He thought about the alternative, which was his son slowly tearing apart as the pull toward his biological mother, toward the forest and whatever life she was offering, grew stronger. On the 4th day, Michael asked if they would let him leave the property. Just for an afternoon, just to walk in the forest near the house, in the areas that were still technically part of their land, but were the edge between the human space and the wild space. David said, "No." Susan said, "Maybe we should consider it." They argued about it. They argued quietly because Michael could hear them, and they didn't want him to feel the weight of their disagreement on his shoulders. But the argument happened. It was the first real argument David and Susan had about Michael's well-being, and it ended with David saying, "If you let him leave, he's not coming back. You understand that. If you open the door, we lose him." Susan said, "Maybe that's not our choice to make." And that was the fundamental disagreement that defined the rest of their lives with Michael. Susan had always believed that Michael was not a possession, that they were not his owners, that at some point he would need to return to the forest and to his mother. David had always believed that Michael was their son and their responsibility, and that allowing him to make decisions based on biological urges he couldn't control was a betrayal of that responsibility. They were both right, and they were both wrong, and there was no solution to it. 2 weeks after the creature appeared at the fence, she came back. This time, it was night. This time, she didn't stop at the fence. She tore through it, ripping out entire sections of reinforced wood and steel, and she walked to the house. David heard the sound of the fence coming down, and he woke up in a state of panic. He had the rifle. He stood at the top of the stairs, and he pointed it at the creature as she moved through the house like she owned it. She stopped. She looked at David. She looked at the rifle. She made a sound that might have been laughter. Michael came downstairs. He was moving toward her before David could stop him. David said, "Don't." Michael said, "I need to hear what she's saying." The creature and Michael moved toward each other. She placed her massive hand on his head. She made sounds. He made sounds back. It was like watching two radio signals trying to sync, adjusting frequency until they found the right channel. Then the creature looked at David. She made a sound that had finality to it. It was not a threat. It was a statement. It was something like, "I'm taking him." David said, "No." The creature's eyes hardened. She looked at David and she took a step forward, and David understood in that moment that if he tried to stop her, she would kill him. The rifle wouldn't matter. Nothing would matter. She was a force of nature in the shape of a mother, and mothers don't negotiate about taking their young. He lowered the rifle. Michael packed a bag. He packed things from his room. He packed photographs. He packed books. He moved slowly, deliberately, saying goodbye to the space that had been his entire world for 10 years. Susan came downstairs and watched her son prepare to leave her. Michael hugged her. He said, "I'll come back. I promise I'll come back." Susan held him and didn't believe him. She knew, the way a mother knows these things, that this was goodbye, that Michael was leaving the house, the 5 acres, the life they'd built for him, and that he was going to the forest and that he was not coming back. He left with his mother an hour before dawn. David and Susan stood on the porch and watched them disappear into the darkness between the trees. The forest took him back. After 10 years of containment, 10 years of being held by the people who loved him, Michael went with his mother, and he went willingly. They didn't call Helen. They reported the fence damage as an animal attack. They reported that they didn't know what animal it was. They said it had come in the night and destroyed their property and left without explanation. Helen visited a few weeks later, and she looked at the fence, and she looked at David and Susan, and she knew that something was wrong with the story, but she didn't press. She filed a report that said Michael Krause had disappeared on the night of September 24th, 2014, under unclear circumstances. The file was sealed. No investigation was launched. Whatever government apparatus existed to monitor Michael's situation was content to let it close. David and Susan lived with the absence. They lived with the not knowing. They waited for Michael to come back. Every night for the first few months, David would walk the property looking for signs that his son had returned, had left a message, was trying to make contact from the forest. He found nothing. Years passed. They got older. They accepted that Michael was not coming back, not in any literal sense. David threw himself into his work. Susan returned to her research. They didn't talk about Michael much. The pain of it was too large to fit into words. Then last spring, David was walking his property and he found a deer hanging from the lower limb of a large aspen tree. It had been dead for days. It had been positioned there deliberately, hanging in a way that couldn't have happened naturally, and underneath it, carved into the bark of the aspen in letters that were deep and angular, was a word, a name, Michael. David sat beneath that aspen for a long time. He understood the message. His son was alive. His son was in the forest. His son was providing, the way his kind provided, the way the creature had taught him, and he was marking the boundary of his territory, showing his father that he existed and that he was not forgotten. David cut the deer down. He left the marks on the tree. He told his wife what he'd found. Susan cried, not from sadness, from relief, from the confirmation that the boy they had raised, the child they had loved, the son who had felt pulled towards something they could never understand, was alive and was present and was marked on the forest in ways they could recognize if they knew where to look. That was the end of David's story. That was the last concrete thing he told me. The rest of it was speculation and grief and years of wondering what had become of the child they had raised. But that's not the end of this story. That's the end of the first version, the one David told me in a cabin near Glenwood Springs on a cold afternoon in March. That's the version of the story where a couple raises their biological and impossible son for 10 years and then lets him go when his mother comes for him. There's another version. There's what happened after the deer in the aspen. There's the part of David's life that came after Michael left, after the door to the human world closed, and his son became fully what his mother's species had always intended. The first weeks were unbearable. Susan wouldn't leave the house. She lay in bed or sat on the couch looking at nothing, and David respected her silence. He knew there was nothing he could say that would make sense of the absence. Michael had been in their lives for a decade. His presence was woven into the fabric of the property. His room was upstairs, still decorated with the things he'd accumulated, books he'd read, drawings he'd made, clothes he'd outgrown. David didn't clean it up. He couldn't. Not yet. By the second month, David began to notice the changes on the property. The fence was still damaged where the mother had torn through it, but around it, someone had begun to repair the damage. New boards, properly attached, using techniques that David recognized as his own. Michael had been watching how his father worked for 10 years. He'd learned. He was fixing the fence from the outside, methodically, without being asked. David found this act of restoration more painful than the departure itself. It meant Michael was thinking about them. It meant he was maintaining the boundary between the human space and the wild space. It meant he was still, in some way, trying to be responsible for the place he'd come from. David stood at the edge of the fence and watched his son's handiwork. The boards were aligned perfectly. The joints were square. The work was competent and careful. Michael had taken everything David had taught him and applied it even in his transformed state. When Susan finally left the house, she went directly to Michael's room and she sat on his bed and she cried in a way that David had never seen before. Not the controlled tears of grief, but the full-bodied breakdown of a mother who had lost her child to something she couldn't fight. David sat with her. They didn't speak. They sat in the room that still smelled faintly like Michael, like the specific combination of soap and the wild animal musk that had become part of his scent as he grew, and they grieved together in the way only two people who had lost the same impossible thing could grieve. David continued to find things in the forest. Every few weeks, marks would appear on trees, fresh gouges carved in angular patterns. Sometimes they formed shapes that might have been words or might have been symbols. David learned to walk to certain spots on his property where Michael left his signs. It became a ritual, a conversation conducted through wood and bark and the slow death of trees. Susan tried to discourage him from going. She said it was painful, that he was torturing himself, that they needed to accept that Michael had moved on and that constantly looking for signs of him was not healthy. But David couldn't stop. His son had left him a way to make contact, and for 6 months, he used it obsessively. He would walk the property at dawn and at dusk, looking for new marks. When he found them, he would sit with them for hours, trying to decode meaning from the angular patterns. Were they words in the language Michael spoke with his mother? Were they just territorial markers? Were they messages at all? Or was David projecting meaning onto random claw marks because he needed to believe his son was still communicating? He began carving responses on different trees. Michael, if you can hear this, we love you. Michael, if you can read this, come home. I don't understand what you're becoming, but I love you anyway. He knew it was likely pointless. Michael had moved beyond the capacity to read human language, perhaps. But the act of carving, of creating marks of his own, made David feel like he was maintaining contact with his son. He never got a response carved back in human language. The only answer was the appearance of new kills. Deer, mostly, hung from branches in ways that suggested deliberate placement. Once a mountain lion, positioned in the center of a clearing, stripped of meat, but left otherwise unmutilated. Once something David couldn't identify, something with claws and a spine that was wrong, in a way that suggested it might have been dangerous to anything that encountered it alive. But it was dead, positioned near the house, too close to the human space. Michael was hunting in his territory and displaying his kills like an apex predator displaying dominance. David understood what his son was doing. Michael was providing. Michael was showing his father that he could survive, that he was becoming proficient at the hunt, that he was learning from his mother and the other creatures of her kind who lived in the deeper forests. These displays were not threats. They were reassurances. Michael was saying, I am learning, I am capable, I am alive. Then in April, David found something else. A piece of fabric hanging from a branch, his shirt. A shirt David had worn regularly for years, the kind of work shirt he put on every morning without thinking about it. Michael must have taken it years ago, kept it close to him. And now he was displaying it in the forest like a trophy or a talisman or a claim of some kind. That same night, David woke to the sound of something large moving through the yard. Not sneaking, not hiding, moving deliberately, letting its presence be known through the weight of each footfall on the ground. He went to the window and saw a shape at the edge of the property line, massive, watching the house. Michael in his full adult form, in the darkness, staring at the place where his parents slept. It was the first time David had seen his son since the night he left. Nearly 5 months. Michael had grown. His shoulders were broader. His face was more angular. He was becoming more like his mother every day. Less like the boy who had sat at the dinner table and eaten with his hands, who had asked questions, who had watched David work and tried to understand how to build things. David considered going outside. He had his hand on the doorknob for a long moment. Then he thought about what Michael had said when he left. "I cannot stay. The forest is calling." And he didn't open the door. He stood at the window and he watched his son watch the place where his father slept. And he let this moment exist in the darkness without intruding on it. Michael stood there for nearly an hour. His amber eyes were focused on the house, on the window where David stood, though it was impossible that Michael could see him in the dark. But David felt seen. He felt the weight of his son's attention like a physical thing. When Michael finally moved, it was slow and deliberate. He turned his massive head and he looked at the forest, and then he looked back at the house one more time. Then he walked away, disappearing into the darkness between the trees like a ghost or a memory or something that had never been solid at all. The next night he came back, and the night after that. It became a pattern. Michael would come to the edge of the property at dusk, and he would stand at the boundary and he would watch the house, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for just a few minutes. David never went outside. He understood that his son needed to see him, needed to know that David was there, needed to maintain the connection in whatever way Michael could maintain it. Susan would watch from different windows. She never said anything about it. She never asked David what it meant. But he knew she was watching too, keeping vigil with him, maintaining their own wordless prayer that their son was alive and that he had not forgotten them completely. One night, about a week into this new pattern, Michael did something different. He came all the way to the porch. He stood there in the darkness and he was silent and still. David, watching from the window, understood that this was an invitation. Michael was saying, "I am here. You can come out now." David put on a heavy jacket. It was only April, but the nights in the mountains were still cold. Susan grabbed his arm as he was reaching for the door. She said, "What if he's not himself anymore? What if the animal has taken over? What if he doesn't recognize you?" David said, "Then he doesn't. But I have to try." He opened the door slowly. Michael was exactly where David had seen him through the window, standing at the edge of the porch, his massive frame silhouetted against the night sky. David stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold and carried the smell of the forest, and underneath that, the smell of his son. The wild animal musk was stronger now, overwhelming, almost acidic in its intensity. Michael said nothing at first. He just looked at his father with those amber eyes that were so familiar and so utterly alien at the same time. David said, "Michael." Michael said, "Hello, Father." His voice was deeper than David remembered. It resonated in his chest. But the inflection was right. The pronunciation was careful, the way it always had been when Michael was learning to speak, concentrating on forming human words with a mouth that was not designed for human language. Each word was precise, shaped with effort, a testament to the thousands of hours Susan had spent teaching him. David said, "I've missed you." Michael said, "I know, I can smell it, the grief. It's everywhere in the house. It's soaked into the porch wood and the door frame and your clothes." David didn't know what to say to that. The idea that his grief had a smell, that his son could track his emotional state through scent the way a tracker reads a trail, was both heartbreaking and strangely intimate. Michael wasn't just leaving. He was taking with him the ability to know his father in ways that humans couldn't know each other. Michael could smell the stress in David's sweat, could read the changes in hormone production that came with loss, could know his father's emotional state more accurately than any words could convey. David realized, standing there on the porch with his son, that Michael had always been two beings. There was the child that David and Susan had raised, and there was the creature that was waking up inside him, the thing his mother's species had made him to be. Right now, in this moment, those two beings existed in balance. But that balance wouldn't last. The creature would grow stronger. It would take what it wanted, and it would leave the child behind. Michael said, "I cannot stay. The forest is calling. But I needed to see you. I needed to confirm that you were alive, and that you were safe, and that you had not abandoned the boundary." David said, "Come inside, just for a few minutes. Susan wants to see you." Michael shook his head. He said, "I cannot. It is not safe for me inside the human space anymore, and it would not be safe for you to have me there. The authorities monitor the property. I can smell them sometimes. Their equipment, their chemicals, the trace markers they leave to track intrusion. If I enter the house, they will know. They will come, and they will take me." David hadn't thought about that, but Michael was right. Helen Reyes had been clear about the monitoring. The government was not going to let an impossible creature walk free without keeping tabs on it. Michael said, "Tell the mother that I am alive. Tell her that I love her. Tell her that the time I spent in her space, the time she spent raising me, it changed me. It made me more than my mother's species makes their young. It gave me something that the forest creatures don't have. It gave me the ability to choose, and I choose to remember you both. I choose to honor the choice you made to raise me and to love me." David said, "You can come back. You can still come back. We can figure it out." Michael said, "No, I cannot come back. I am what I am now, and what I am belongs to the forest and to my mother and to the wild things that are becoming my family. But I will stay on your property. I will mark the boundaries the way my kind marks territory, and I will make sure that nothing hunts you or the mother who raised me. This is my place now. You are my place. And I will keep you safe from the things that come from deeper in the mountains, the things even my mother fears. There are creatures in the Sawatch Range that are older than the mountains. There are things that hunt in packs and make sounds that even the bears flee from. I will make sure they do not find you." Michael's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, some quality that David recognized as fear. His son was afraid of something beyond the human world, something even more dangerous than Michael had become. David said, "Michael, what are you afraid of?" Michael said, "There are treaties, old ones, between my mother's kind and the things that live in the deep places. But treaties break, boundaries shift. Sometimes the things in the deep places grow hungry, and they test the edges of what they are allowed to hunt." Michael looked at his father with an intensity that was almost unbearable to witness. It was the same look that had been in his eyes when he was a child sitting at the dinner table, trying to understand the world through human language. But there was loss in it now, and certainty, and something like resignation to his own nature. Michael said, "I love you. I need you to know that. I love you, and I love the mother who raised me, and I am grateful for every day I spent in your house. But I cannot go back to it. Do you understand?" David said, "I understand. I don't accept it, but I understand." Michael said, "Acceptance will come. It takes time, but you will see that I am not lost. I am just different. I am what I was always meant to be." Michael reached out one massive clawed hand, and he placed it gently on his father's shoulder. The claws were retracted. The touch was careful. It was the gesture of a creature fully aware of its own strength and the fragility of the human it was touching. Then Michael turned and walked off the porch into the darkness, and David didn't see him again for 6 months. One night in May, Michael did something different. He didn't just watch from the boundary. He came to the porch. He knocked on the door. Actually knocked, in a pattern that was deliberate and structured. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. The same pattern he'd learned from his father 10 years earlier. David opened the door. Michael stood on the porch in the darkness. He was exactly what his mother had been when she first appeared at the fence. 7.5 feet tall, massive, visibly not human. But his eyes were the same eyes David knew. Michael's eyes, his son's eyes, amber and warm and full of something that David recognized as love. Michael said, "I cannot stay. The forest is calling. But I needed to see you." He sounded older, not just physically older, but like he'd lived more life in the 4 months he'd been gone than in the 10 years he'd spent in the house. David said, "Come inside." Michael shook his head. He said, "I cannot. It is not safe for me inside the human space anymore, and it is not safe for you to have me here. The authorities monitor the property." David hadn't thought about that, but Michael was right. Helen Reyes and her department would be aware of any contact. Michael said, "I came to tell you that I am alive. I came to tell you that the time I spent in your house, the time you spent raising me, it mattered. It made me who I am. The part of me that is intelligent, that is thoughtful, that chooses not to hunt humans even though I could, that is because of you. Because you raised me to be more than just the animal my mother made me to be." David said, "You can come back. You can still come back." Michael said, "No, I cannot. I am what I am now, and what I am belongs to the forest. But I will stay on your property. I will mark the boundaries the way my kind marks territory, and I will make sure that nothing hunts you or my mother. This is my place now. You are my place, and I will keep you safe from the things that come from deeper in the mountains, the things even my mother fears." Michael looked at his father with an intensity that was almost unbearable to witness. Michael said, "I love you. I need you to know that. I love you and I love the mother who raised me, and I am grateful for every day I spent in your house. But I cannot go back to it. Do you understand?" David said, "I understand. I don't accept it, but I understand." Michael said, "Acceptance will come. It takes time. But you will see that I am not lost. I am just different. I am what I was always meant to be." Then Michael turned and walked off the porch into the darkness, and David didn't see him again for 6 months. But the marks kept appearing. The food would be taken. David would find evidence of Michael's presence everywhere, scat in distinctive patterns, claw marks on trees in specific formations. Once, David found an entire elk that had been killed and quartered in a way that showed precise, methodical skill. The meat was arranged carefully, almost deliberately, Michael leaving a message. Michael showing his father that he had learned to survive, that he was a hunter, that he was part of the cycle in the way his mother was part of the cycle. Susan wanted to leave. She couldn't handle the constant reminder of what they'd lost and what Michael had become. David refused. He said, "He's our son. If we abandon the property, we're saying we don't believe him, we don't trust him, we're rejecting him. I won't do that." They argued about it more than once. But Susan eventually accepted that this was David's way of coping, and she couldn't force him to leave. So they stayed. But the marks kept appearing. The food would be taken. David would find evidence of Michael's presence everywhere. Scat in distinctive patterns that David had begun to recognize as messages in their own way. Claw marks on trees in specific formations. Once, David found an entire elk that had been killed and quartered in a way that showed precise, methodical skill. The meat was arranged carefully, almost deliberately, positioned in sections on the ground in a way that human hunters never arrange their kills. Michael leaving a message. Michael showing his father that he had learned to survive, that he was a hunter, that he was part of the cycle in the way his mother was part of the cycle. David brought the meat to processors. He couldn't waste it. He sold it to restaurants in Glenwood Springs, and he used the money to pay the property taxes and to keep the house in repair. In some bizarre way, he was feeding off his son's hunts. The creature Michael had become was sustaining the human family Michael had left behind. Susan wanted to leave. She couldn't handle the constant reminder of what they'd lost and what Michael had become. She proposed it to David one night as they sat on the porch watching the darkness gather in the forest. She said, "I can't do this anymore. Every day I'm waiting for him to come back, or every day I'm hoping he doesn't. It's unsustainable. We need to sell the property and move somewhere that doesn't remind me of what he is now." David said, "He's our son." Susan said, "I know. That's what makes it worse. If he was just a creature, if he was just something we imagined, I could move on. But he's Michael. He's still out there. And every time I see blood on the fence or claw marks on a tree, I'm seeing what he's become, and I can't accept it." David said, "If we abandon the property, we're saying we don't believe him, we don't trust him, we're rejecting him. I won't do that." They argued about it more than once. Not shouting arguments, but the quiet, devastating arguments of a long marriage breaking under the weight of loss. Susan would leave the room. David would sit on the porch. They would sleep separately. They would eat meals in silence, but they never actually separated. Some part of each of them understood that Michael had required them to stay, had built a dependency into his leaving that meant David and Susan could not move on, because moving on would be a betrayal of the bond they had established when they brought him into their home 10 years earlier. Eventually, Susan accepted that this was David's way of coping, and she couldn't force him to leave. She moved back into the bedroom with him. They started eating meals together again. They began to rebuild the life they had before Michael's mother came to the fence, knowing that it would never be the same, but hoping that it could be something other than simply enduring loss. They stayed on the property. They maintained it. They fixed the fence where it was damaged. They kept the house clean. They lived as if Michael might return at any moment, even though both of them knew that he never would in any meaningful way. Years passed. 5 years. 6 years. Michael came to the porch once more, briefly just to show David that he was still alive, still maintaining the boundary, still the keeper of the space between the human world and the wild world. He looked more like his mother every time David saw him. The human features he'd inherited from Susan were becoming less dominant. His face was hardening, becoming more lupine. His body was more muscular, more defined. He was becoming fully what he was meant to be, leaving behind the comfortable humanness he'd learned from his parents, But his eyes remained the same, those amber eyes that had looked at David from his crib 10 years ago, that had watched him carve wood and build shelves, that had held gratitude and love and an unbearable sadness all at once. In the spring of 2020, Helen Reyes came to the property for the last time. She was older, gray at the temples, moving more slowly than she had before. She came without warning, without calling first. She walked the property methodically, examining every tree, every mark, every piece of evidence of Michael's presence. She looked at the repaired fence. She looked at the bloodstains on the ground where David had butchered elk. She looked at everything with the eye of someone who was making a final assessment. When she came back to the house, David and Susan were waiting for her on the porch. Helen said, "He never left Colorado. There were sightings, official sightings, reported to state wildlife, reported to the Forest Service. A creature matching his description, operating as a territorial predator in the Boulder and Sawtooth mountain range, approximately 80 miles east of here. Every report has been filed and flagged and buried in the same place all the others are buried. The cryptid files, the impossible sightings, the things that don't officially exist." David said, "Is he safe?" Helen said, "As safe as anything that hunts for a living can be. He's established territory. He's avoided human conflict. He's operating within the parameters of a successful apex predator. From our perspective, he's the ideal outcome. He exists outside of human civilization. He poses no direct threat to public safety. He maintains the ecological balance by being exactly what he's supposed to be." Susan said, "How do you know it's him? How do you know it's Michael?" Helen said, "Because the reports describe a creature with unusual intelligence, a predator that avoids populated areas with precision, a thing that has learned to use human techniques in its hunting strategy. It kills cleanly. It caches meat strategically. It never leaves a trail that could lead back to populated areas. No predator we've documented behaves this way. Animals don't calculate risk the way your son calculates risk. That's not the behavior of a pure animal. That's the behavior of something that was raised by humans and never fully forgot how to think like a human. It's something caught between two worlds, and it's surviving because it inherited the best parts of both." Helen looked at David with an expression of something close to compassion. Helen said, "The paperwork is done. Michael Kraus is dead. On paper, he died in 2014, the night he disappeared. The legal framework allows him to be dead. It allows you to move on. It allows us to close the file and monitor him from a different apparatus, something that is separate from the legal guardianship you signed." David said, "Why are you telling me this?" Helen said, "Because you have a right to know that your son is alive, and because I wanted you to know that what he chose to do with his life, what he chose to become, it's not unusual, not for his kind. The process from juvenile to adult takes time. The behavioral changes you've observed are normal. He's not lost. He's metamorphosing. He's becoming what his mother's species is. And that's not a failure of your parenting. That's biology. That's the fundamental law of his existence." Helen turned to leave. Then she paused at the edge of the porch. Helen said, "There's something you should know. The other adults of his kind, the territorial creatures operating in the deeper forests, they don't normally accept a hybrid. Hybrids are seen as weak, contaminated, a threat to the bloodline. But your son's territory borders his mother's. She's defending him actively. She's making sure the older ones understand that he is hers and he belongs to the place he's claimed. It's possible that he would not have survived this long without that maternal protection. She's enforcing an invisible boundary around him, saying, 'This one is mine. You don't touch this one.'" Helen said, "You gave him something no one else of his kind gets. You gave him time to develop fully before being forced into the wild. You gave him language and intelligence and the capacity to choose. Most of them don't get that. Most of them are born into the wilderness with instinct and hunger and nothing else. They survive or they don't. Your son survived because of you, and now he's surviving because he carries what you gave him. The intelligence, the ability to think through a problem instead of just react to it. That's your legacy in him." Helen left after that conversation. David never saw her again. In 2023, David and Susan sold the property. Not because Michael asked them to, not because they wanted to abandon the boundary he'd established, but because they were getting older and the constant reminder of what they'd lost had worn them down over nearly a decade. The The property was becoming a mausoleum to a grief they could not process. David was 72 years old. Susan was 70. They were tired. They sold to a young couple from Denver who wanted to be close to the national forest and who didn't ask many questions about the fence repairs or the claw marks on the aspen trees. David and Susan moved to Glenwood Springs proper, to a condo with neighbors and streets and human voices, and the loss of the silence they'd shared with Michael for so many years. David said to me, "We drive by the property sometimes, not often, maybe once a month. We don't stop. We just drive by and look at it and remember what it was like to have him in the house, to have a son, briefly, impossibly. Sometimes I wonder if he knows we're gone, if he comes to the porch in the nights and finds it empty and understands that we finally let go, or if he doesn't come anymore because the boundary is closed and he's moved on to whatever his life became with his mother and the other things that live in the deep mountains." Helen said, "The paperwork is done. Michael Kraus is dead. On paper, he died in 2014, the night he disappeared. The legal framework allows him to be dead. It allows you to move on. It allows us to close the file and monitor him from a different apparatus, something that is separate from the legal guardianship." David said, "Why are you telling me this?" Helen said, "Because you have a right to know that your son is alive. And because I wanted you to know that what he chose to do with his life, what he chose to become, it's not unusual. Not for his kind. The process from juvenile to adult takes time. The behavioral changes you've observed are normal. He's not lost. He's metamorphosing. He's becoming what his mother's species is. And that's not a failure of your parenting. That's biology. That's destiny." David said, "What will happen to him?" Helen said. "The same thing that happens to them. He'll establish territory. He'll hunt. He'll live in the wilderness away from human populations. He'll be monitored from a distance to ensure he doesn't pose a public safety risk." But as far as the official record goes, Michael Kraus died 8 years ago, and his parents continue to live in their house on 5 acres because they love the forest. That's the story. Helen left after that conversation. David never saw her again. He took a long time to answer. He looked out the window of the coffee shop where we were sitting, and he said, "Every day I raised him, I knew it would end like this. Susan knew it too. You can't raise something like Michael without understanding that he's always going to be something other than what you are. The only question was whether we loved him anyway, whether we did it anyway, knowing the price. And the answer is yes, we did it anyway." He said, "The world doesn't have a lot of space for the impossible, for things that don't fit the categories, for creatures that are part animal and part intelligent and part something we don't have a name for. We made space. We raised him. We gave him language and love and the sense that he was not a monster, that he was a person, flawed and strange and impossible, but a person. And when the time came to let him go, we did. We let him leave because that's what love is sometimes. It's knowing when to hold on and knowing when to open your hands and let something fly toward what it was always meant to be." David teaches carpentry now. He teaches young men who are looking to learn a trade, kids in their 20s who can't afford 4-year degrees, and who want to build something with their hands the way David has built things his entire life. He's patient with them in a way that suggests he's learned something profound about teaching. He breaks down complex tasks into simple steps. He explains not just what to do, but why you do it that way. And he watches for the moment when something clicks, when a student understands that they have the capacity to make something beautiful and functional with raw materials and their own 2 hands. One of his students asked him why he cares so much, why he puts in the extra time. David said, "Because there are people out there who are never going to fit into the world as it's designed. They're going to be too tall or too strange or too different. And if you can teach them that they have a skill, that they can create, that they can build things that matter, then maybe they have a chance at a life that makes sense to them, even if that life is completely different from the lives of normal people." His students don't know about Michael. They don't know why David teaches with such intentionality, such care, but they feel it. I asked David if Michael ever made contact after they moved. David said he doesn't know. He doesn't go back to the property. He doesn't check the trees for new marks. He's made a choice to close that chapter. But sometimes, on nights when the wind is coming from the mountains, he can smell something familiar in the air, something wild and warm and utterly unmistakable. And he lets himself believe that his son is still there, still keeping watch, still making sure that the space between the human world and the forest world is marked and guarded and safe. David told me that he carries something with him. A piece of fabric from the shirt Michael had worn when he was 12 years old. It's small, torn from the collar, kept in a drawer next to his bed. Sometimes, late at night when Susan is sleeping, he takes it out and holds it. It still carries a faint scent that's not quite human. He said that touching it reminds him that those 10 years were real, that Michael was real, that he didn't imagine his son. The shirt has faded over the years, the fabric is worn thin from handling, but David keeps it anyway. Susan has her own memorial. She kept one of Michael's drawings, a sketch he made when he was 9 years old, showing the property from above. The perspective is accurate. Michael has drawn the house, the fence, the forest beyond, and he's drawn them with understanding. He understood the spatial relationships. He understood proportion. He understood the place he lived the way only someone who deeply belonged could understand a place. The drawing hangs in a frame in their bedroom where only David and Susan see it. He said, "I'm telling you this story because it needs to exist somewhere. Because people need to know that sometimes the monsters we're afraid of are just the young versions of things that love us, and we love them back. They need to know that biology is not destiny, but it's close. They need to know that you can do everything right and still lose everything. And they need to know that sometimes losing everything is the right choice. It's the loving choice. It's the human choice." I don't have a postscript for this story. I don't have resolution. David still lives in Glenwood Springs. He teaches carpentry to younger men looking for a trade. He lives with Susan. They are quiet people now, in a way they weren't before. They've survived something that shouldn't be survivable. They've lost something that shouldn't have existed in the first place. But they don't regret it. And that might be the most important part of this story. Not the creature, not the forest, not the impossible things that exist in the margins of the wilderness. The most important part is that two ordinary people saw something impossible and loved it anyway, raised it, nurtured it, and then let it go, because that was the only way they could possibly love it, right? If you're watching this and you have something in your life that doesn't fit the categories, something that the world doesn't have words for, something that everyone else is afraid of, maybe hold it a little closer. Maybe love it anyway. Maybe do what David and Susan did and make space for the impossible, because the impossible is out there. It's in the mountains and the forests and the places we don't go at night. And sometimes, if we're lucky, it's standing on our porch knocking in a pattern we taught it, reminding us that it hasn't forgotten us. Michael Krause is still alive, as far as I know. He's somewhere in the Boulder and Sawtooth range, living in the wilderness with his mother's kind. He's the product of two worlds, human and other, raised by people who chose love over fear and then chose to let him go, because that was the only way they could truly love him. David and Susan never had another child after Michael. They never tried. They understood, without needing to discuss it, that what they had experienced with Michael was singular, unrepeatable, a moment in their lives when the impossible became real, and they chose to embrace it rather than reject it. That's the story of how a couple raised a DOGMAN Pup for 10 years, and then watched him walk into the forest to become exactly what he was always meant to be,